poetry. So we're going to look at some key elements of poetry and what makes something a poem. We're also going to look at some things you should keep an eye out for when you're reading poetry to make it more meaningful, like literary devices. So first of all, what is poetry? So poetry is literature that uses the sounds, rhythms, and meanings of words to describe the world. A lot of times when we think of poetry, we think of something that rhymes, but that's not always true. It's just any kind of literature that uses words in a way that we wouldn't just read them in a novel maybe. And any poet is trying to describe their experience in the world. So some elements of poetry, we're actually looking at a poem. So lines in a poem are just a group of words. They're just the individual lines, like that one first line, second line, whereas a stanza is an organized unit of lines. They work together to express one key idea. So one chunk of a poem is a stanza, just like it's written here. And so you can see that this is a stanza because there's a space in between. So it's broken apart and it visually looks like it's separated, like a paragraph by itself. And usually each stanza has its own key idea, and that's what makes it its own stanza. Poetry also has that stanza break. It's a blank line. It signals that one stanza has ended and a new stanza is beginning. So this little blank line that we just looked at right here, that is your stanza break right here. So that way the reader knows that that is a stanza. A refrain. A refrain is a line or group of lines that repeat at regular intervals. So for instance, in music, we know that a refrain is typically that little catchy line that comes right before the chorus, and every time the singer goes to sing the chorus, they sing that same little refrain, that same catchy line. So a refrain in a poem is a line or group of lines that repeat regularly throughout the poem. And the point of this is that it reminds readers and listeners of a key idea, image, or event. It keeps bringing us back to something that's really important or central to the poem, some key idea. A variation is when you're changing one or more words with each repetition. So every time you repeat this refrain, maybe one or two words changes a little bit. So we have some sound devices. So when we look at poetry, poetry is not meant to just be read on a piece of paper. Poetry is meant to be read out loud. And because it's meant to be read out loud, poets will take advantage of that, and the sound of the poem is actually very important to the way that we interpret it. So the way that we understand the poem, when we listen to it out loud, it gives more meaning to that understanding. So a rhythm. A rhythm is a beat created by stressed and unstressed syllables in words. So the same way that there's a rhythm in music, certain syllables in words in a poem might create that same kind of rhythm, and a poet will create a rhythm for a reason. A meter is a pattern of rhythm, so if there's a clear pattern throughout the poem, it's called a meter. Then we have rhyme, which we're all familiar with. It's the repetition of vowel and consonant sounds at the ends of words, like tin and pin. So we have a lot of rhyming. A rhyme scheme is a particular pattern that rhymes follow throughout a poem. So when we're talking about the ending of each line in a poem rhyming, we look throughout the whole poem and we identify what's called a rhyme scheme. So we're going to look at an example of that. So the rhyme scheme in this poem is A, B, A, B. If someone asked me what the rhyme scheme is, I would say it's A, B, A, B. In order to find this, what I do is I read each line. So how doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale. I look at the words that rhyme. So the last word here is crocodile. So that's going to be line A. That's my first rhyme in this poem. Then the next line is tail. Tail does not rhyme with crocodile. So it's not going to be A because they don't rhyme. It's going to be B. It's a new rhyme that appears in this poem. Then I have Nile. Well, Nile rhymes with crocodile, so it's also going to be A because it's the same rhyme. And then scale rhymes with tail. So that is also going to be B because that's the same rhyme. If this poem continued and the next line had a brand new rhyme that didn't appear, it doesn't rhyme with crocodile or Nile or tail or scale, then we would call that line C. And you continue like this throughout the poem. So all of the lines that have the same rhyme at the end are considered one same letter, and you would reference this as saying this poem has a rhyme scheme of AB, AB. So then we have literary devices, and just like in a novel, a poet takes advantage of literary devices to give meaning to what they're saying. And so as I mentioned before, because poetry is meant to be read out loud, the poet will take advantage of what it sounds like when it's read out loud, and these are called sound devices. So we have alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginnings of words. So this is important. It's a consonant sound. So a consonant are letters in the alphabet that are very specific. You have consonants and you have vowels. It is not alliteration if the words all start with a vowel, so A, E, I, O, U. If the words that are repeating all start with a vowel, it's not considered alliteration. They have to start with a consonant letter. So like Peter Piper picked a pair of pickled peppers. That's alliteration, that repetition of that consonant P. Another sound device is onomatopoeia, and that's the use of words that imitate sounds. So wham, bang, splat, ouch, boom, meow, or oink, or woof. Those are all onomatopoeia. It's words that stand for sounds. So when we look at the language that a poet is using, different words have different meanings. And there's a connotation and a denotation to language. So those are two different things that are kind of tricky. So when we're talking about a specific word, the denotation is the word's literal meaning. So if I were to look up that word in a dictionary, it would be the dictionary definition of that word. But at the same time, words have a connotation. So a connotation are the ideas and feelings that the words bring to mind. So if I looked up that word in the dictionary, I might not necessarily get that connotation. I would get its denotation. So let's look at an example. So you may live in a house, but we live in a home. So those two words, house and home, we're looking at the denotation and connotation. So as it explains here, if you were to look up the words house and home in a dictionary, you would find that both words have approximately the same meaning. They both mean a dwelling place, someplace that we live. However, the speaker in the sentence above suggests that home has an additional meaning. Aside from this strict dictionary definition, or denotation, many people associate such things as comfort, love, security, or privacy with a home, but do not necessarily make the same associations with a house. So because house and home have the same denotation, dictionary meaning, they literally mean the same thing, but they have different connotations. The feelings that I get when I think of the word house are very different than the feelings that I get when I think of the word home. So a couple more examples. The word sour. Its denotation, its dictionary definition, is just a flavor. But when I think of the word sour, if I were to describe someone as being sour, I would think that they're unpleasant, like an unpleasant person. If I said that Lucy was very sour this morning, it sounds very negative or unpleasant. That's its connotation. Its denotation, its dictionary definition, a flavor. Well, Susie can't actually be a sour flavor. I'm not going to walk up to her and lick her. So we're thinking about the connotation there. And same thing as crab. The denotation, a dictionary definition, is it's an animal. It's a crustacean. However, if I said that Lucy was really crabby this morning, it means that she was really grumpy, There's a negative connotation there, a negative feeling associated with that word, that she's kind of crabby. And so poets will use connotation and denotation very specifically in their writing. So some other literary devices that poets are going to use. Imagery. We've talked about this. Imagery are descriptions that appeal to the 5 senses. It helps poets convey what they see, hear, taste, smell, and touch. So it's anything that's really adding that extra description. So they give you some examples here, like for sight. The tiny red ant climbed up the broken twig. Could just say the ant climbed. This gives us really what it would look like. The smell, the sweet smell of freshly baked apple filled the air. That's very different than saying, I just baked an apple pie. Taste, one bite of the sour lemon caused my lips to pucker. Could have just said, the lemon was sour, or I ate a lemon. Imagery gives a lot more description, and it allows your reader to experience what it is you're experiencing, so it makes it more meaningful. So again, the child got mad at the teacher. Does this sentence paint a picture for the reader? Are there details that would appeal to the reader's senses? Not really. It's a very boring sentence. So you could take a simple sentence like this and try to appeal to your reader's 5 senses to make it more interesting and paint a picture for that reader. Simile. A simile is a form of comparison in which one thing is compared to another unlike thing by using specific words of comparison like or as. So the key things here, you need to be comparing something. Just any good old sentence that uses like or as is not a simile. You have to be comparing 2 unlike things, 2 very different things. So similar to that, a metaphor compares 2 unlike things. So again, you must be comparing and they must be 2 different things, but it doesn't use like or as. So here we have a simile, just from the fireworks song by Katy Perry, just own the night like the 4th of July. That's a simile. It's comparing 2 things, this night and the 4th of July. 2 unlike things, and we used the word like here. And so by doing this, I've given my reader extra meaning that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Personification. That means you're speaking of something that is not human as if it had human abilities and human reactions. This has the word person right in it. Makes it easy to remember. So you're giving something that's not a person qualities. So like in Toy Story, they're just toys, but we make them like humans. We personify them. 2 other examples, the sunlight danced. The sunlight can't actually dance, a human dances, but we're giving it human-like qualities. The streets are calling me, saying that the street can speak is personification. And again, poets use this for a very specific reason. So, when we're looking at poems, every form of poetry has its own structure. So there's all kinds of different types of poems, and these are just a few of them that we're going to quickly look at. So what that means is that a poem might be structured a certain way, and so it fits in one of these specific categories. So narrative poetry. Narrative poetry tells a story in verse, just like the word, think of the word narrative, like a story. Narrative poems have elements similar to those in short stories, such as plot and characters. So it's a kind of a story, but it's told in a kind of a musical way. That's what makes it a poem. Haiku is a 3-line Japanese form that describes something in nature, and this has a very specific structure. So the first and the third lines each have 5 syllables, and the second line has 7 syllables. So it's going to be a 3-line poem, and that particular format is what makes it haiku. Free verse. This is poetry defined by its lack of structure. So there's really no rhyme or reason to the way that the poet has structured it. It has no regular meter, rhyme, fixed line length, or specific stanza pattern. So there's no patterns that we can find in this poem. So an example, snowflakes were falling all around me. like a blanket covering me, hiding me from the world, until I was disguised as a snowman. There's no clear rhyme here. Each line has a different number of words. There's no patterns. There's no rhyming. There's no nothing. So this is just called free verse. The writer just went with it. Lyric poetry is poetry that expresses the thoughts and the feelings of a single speaker in its awfully highly melodic verse. That means it sounds like a song. So it's usually the thoughts or feelings of one person, and it kind of sounds like a song when it's read out loud. Ballads. So ballads are also song-like poems, and these tell stories. So they sound like songs, and a lot of songs actually could be considered ballads, and they're telling stories. They often deal with adventure or romance. So here, Taylor Swift is a good example of her songs are a lot of love stories, a lot of her own experiences of heartbreak or whatever. And so a ballad is a song-like poem that's telling a story like that. Concrete poetry. These are very specific to their structure. It's poems that are shaped to look like their subjects, literally shaped like that. So the poet arranges the lines to create a picture on the page. So if you read this poem right here, it's about a star, a sparkle way up, high one to make all your wishes upon, high in the nighttime sky, blinking like a broken traffic light. So this is a poem about a star, and the poet has literally made it look like a star on the page. That's concrete poetry. Limericks. Limericks are humorous, they rhyme, and they're 5-line poems, and they have a very clear, specific rhythm pattern and rhyme scheme, and they're usually very funny. So those are the different kinds of poems, and we look at them based on their structure. And so that's it for your notes for this. Make sure you have all of your blanks filled in. If you don't, go ahead and rewind a little bit and get those filled in.